As the sun sets over Camp Sable, a catastrophic helicopter crash leaves an Apache in ruins. General Vance demands it be flight ready by dawn, a task deemed impossible. Amid the chaos, a quiet janitor named Frank Sawyer steps forward. Laughed off at first, Frank stuns everyone with his calm authority and deep knowledge. Piece by piece, he revives the broken bird, revealing a past no one expected. Who is this man with grease-stained hands and eyes full of unspoken stories? And what will happen when he climbs into the cockpit himself? Stay tuned, because what follows defies every expectation. If this story inspired you or made you rethink what true heroism looks like, support our channel. Hit the like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe for more powerful, real stories of quiet courage. Let's honor the hidden heroes who walk among us every day, just like Frank Sawyer. Frank Sawyer moved without hesitation, the quiet resolve in his steps defying the weight of the moment. "What's next, Frank? Going to mop the cockpit too?" Someone jeered, the voice cutting through the heat-thick air, tinged with cruel amusement. Laughter followed, sharp and dismissive, but Frank didn't even blink. He set the mop down beside a rusted barrel, wiped the grease from his hands onto the thighs of his worn coveralls, and stepped forward, toward the shattered remains of the Apache. He walked steadily, his posture upright, focused. The noise behind him might as well have been wind. The entire base stilled. Conversations faltered, boots slowed. Even the hum of idle machinery seemed to hush as eyes followed the quiet janitor. Frank, the man they'd barely noticed for months, now stood at the center of something extraordinary. His hands, cracked and weathered from years of labor, moved with a strange, deliberate grace. Just 2 hours before, that Apache had been declared beyond salvation. Specialists had examined it, heads shaking, voices low, words like total loss and no chance tossed into the sun-soaked wind. But Frank had stepped in, said nothing, and simply began to work. No fanfare, no permission asked. Wrenches clicked, panels groaned open. Tools vanished into the machinery as he moved like a man possessed, not by ego, but by something deeper. Knowledge hard-earned, buried far beneath the surface of his quiet life. Now the battered Apache stood upright. Its blades turned once, then twice, and then roared to life with the full-throated growl of rebirth. Gasps rippled through the gathered soldiers like a current. And as Frank climbed into the cockpit, without a word, without ceremony, and lifted the bird into the air, a collective silence fell. Who was this man they had dismissed as a janitor? But to understand the gravity of that moment, you had to go back, just hours earlier, when the sun still blazed high above Camp Sable, a massive military outpost etched into the unforgiving desert. It was a place where routine wrapped itself around every soldier like armor. Orders barked over radios, engines roared, boots pounded concrete in synchronized rhythm. The sky was vast, the air dry and hot enough to shimmer above the ground like phantom flame. That afternoon, the heat had turned oppressive. Shadows grew long across the landing pads, and everything felt suspended in a haze of exhaustion and expectation. But it all changed with a sound. At first so familiar it didn't register as a warning. The low rhythmic chop of rotor blades cutting through the density of desert air. Heads turned, a few eyes narrowed, expecting to see an Apache return from training. But what approached was something else. The aircraft sagged in the air, unbalanced, its nose tilting slightly off-axis. It was coming in too low, too fast. The tail dragged like dead weight. The thrum of the rotors was wrong, staggered, panicked, fighting itself with every turn. The unease crackled through the base, a static tension that made breath catch in every throat. Then came the voice, strained and distorted through the radio's haze. "Camp Sable Tower, this is Talon 1. Hydraulic failure. Yaw controls gone sloppy. She's not responding clean. Request emergency landing clearance. Over." A pause followed, short, terrible, the kind that makes the world tilt on its axis. Hydraulic failure in an Apache wasn't a minor hiccup. It was a death sentence spelled in steel and fire. "Talon 1, you're cleared. Priority landing. We're standing by." But the words couldn't stop what was already happening. The Apache was falling, barely steered by the pilot's desperate hands. You could see him inside, wrestling the flight stick, trying to squeeze a miracle from the broken machine. The bird pitched down, then up again. It jolted like it was being dragged through invisible currents. It wasn't flying, it was clawing through the sky, dragged by experience and the sheer will to survive. Then the impact came. The skids struck first, too hard. Rubber shredded instantly, fragments flying like shrapnel. The frame groaned, metal buckling under the raw energy. Sparks erupted in arcs, tiny meteors across the tarmac as steel and concrete met in violent union. The tail rotor, already struggling, clipped the ground at a deadly angle. It burst into a blinding spray of sparks, the force twisting the tail and dragging the fuselage sideways. The main rotors spun uselessly, biting into air as the aircraft screamed across the pad, the shriek of metal pain itself. Beneath the cata, there came the deep whoomph of ignition, fuel touching flame. Bright tongues of fire leapt from beneath the tail. The smell followed immediately, acrid, thick, unforgettable. Burning hydraulic fluid, scorched rubber, jet fuel, the kind of scent that lives in the back of your throat for days. Then silence. For a breath, maybe two, the base held still, frozen. No one moved. The world narrowed to the broken bird and the rising smoke curling into the golden skyline. And then chaos returned, alarms blared. Fire trucks roared from the hangars, spraying thick white foam even before they stopped. Medics sprinted forward, red crosses flashing against the smoke. The cockpit popped open. A figure staggered out, bloody, bruised, but alive. The pilot collapsed to his knees, eyes wide, staring as if waiting for the dream to end. But this wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare written in fire and steel. The echo of the crash still lingered when the heavy cadence of boots signaled the arrival of General Robert Vance. You didn't need to see him to know he was there. The atmosphere shifted. Authority radiated from him like heat off the tarmac. He marched with purpose, a wall of silence following his wake. His uniform was untouched by the dust and heat, ribbons and stars arranged with impossible precision. The brim of his cap cast a hard shadow over his eyes, cold, sharp, commanding. And the moment his gaze fell on the wreckage, and then on the man approaching it, the story of Frank Sawyer began to rewrite everything they thought they knew. Frank's steady steps from the shadows. Women on the flight line straightened instinctively, shoulders squaring even if their lungs still heaved from the mad sprint toward the smoking wreck. That's just the effect General Vance had. Command wrapped around him like armor. He didn't need medals to prove his worth. His presence was enough. Authority radiated off him in silent waves, sharpened over time by action, not ceremony. And now, with the Apache lying in ruins, action was all that mattered. 10 feet from the wreckage, Vance halted, arms clasped behind him. The helicopter was barely recognizable. Its frame buckled beneath the weight of the crash. Rotor blades twisted like the wings of some great bird struck mid-flight. Viscous trails of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel streaked the concrete like blood, and the harsh tang of scorched metal clung to the air like a warning. Vance's gaze moved methodically over the wreck, sharp and assessing. He'd seen worse, but that didn't mean he accepted it. His eyes tracked along the tail assembly, paused on the splintered rotor shafts, slid over the snapped skids and mangled avionics bay. His mind was always in motion, computing, analyzing, recalibrating. His voice broke the hush of the makeshift command tent, not loud, not urgent, just precise. How long? The question didn't come with a bark. Vance never needed to raise his voice. His authority lived in the silence between syllables. Everyone on that line understood the stakes. From behind the cordon of medics and fire crews, Dawson stepped forward. Lead technician, not quite 30. There was still a trace of youth softening the edges of his face. But right now, every inch of him was locked in tension. His jaw clenched tight, eyes darted from the smoldering remains of the helicopter to the general's unreadable expression. "Sir," Dawson said, swallowing hard, "the damage is extensive. Hydraulic systems are gone. Main rotor shafts are cracked. Avionics offline. Skids are shot. Realistically, it'll take at least 48 hours. 72 if we want her combat ready." The words hung in the dry air like smoke. The entire base seemed to freeze. Even the wind held its breath. Vance didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed on Dawson, as if willing him to find a better answer in the corners of his mind. When none came, a muscle in Vance's cheek jumped. Tight, subtle, but unmistakable. The burden of command was settling hard. Wrong answer. Two calm words, spoken low. But they hit like a punch to the chest. Vance turned from Dawson, sweeping the crew with his gaze, letting it land on each of them in turn, letting the silence bite. Then he spoke, his voice lifting just enough to cut through the buzz of equipment and the distant whine of emergency sirens. I don't need this bird flying in 2 or 3 days. I need it flying by dawn. By 0600 hours, that helicopter is airborne. Operational. Figure it out. The effect was instant, a shift in the air, like a sudden drop in temperature. Muscles tensed, eyes widened. No one spoke. Dawson opened his mouth, then shut it again. His brain raced, looping through logistics, physics, engineering limitations. His voice, when it came, was laced with disbelief. Sir, with respect, physics don't bend for a deadline. We'll need parts. Time for fabrication. Vance cut him off with a simple raise of the hand. It wasn't impatient, just final. I didn't ask for an excuse, son. I asked for a solution. There was no anger in his voice. If anything, it carried something deeper. Faith. A bone-deep belief that his team, despite the odds, could pull off the impossible. Because failure wasn't just unacceptable, it was unimaginable. Vance stepped in closer to Dawson, voice low now, just for those nearest. There's a mission on the line. There are lives depending on that Apache. I know it's a tall order, but I've seen miracles come out of sweat and willpower. And you've got both. Now show me. Dawson nodded slowly, though his face was still pale and his eyes betrayed the storm within. He turned on his heel, shouting orders, burying his panic beneath urgency. Around him, the crew sprang into motion. Minds racing, calculations churning, tools gathered, checklists made, parts scavenged. Smoke from the crash still curled upward, trailing into the vast night sky as the cold of the high plains crept in. The desert evening wrapped Camp Sable in stillness, shadows growing long across the cracked tarmac. But the crew had their orders. Somehow, some way, they would have to make it happen. Floodlights roared to life, flooding the worksite in harsh white glare. Sparks flew, tools clanged, voices snapped orders through the growing hum of effort. The tension in the air was electric, humming just beneath the surface like a coiled storm. And in the middle of it all, unnoticed by most, a quiet figure stood watching. Frank Sawyer, his hair gone silver beneath a well-worn ball cap. His work jumpsuit faded from years of wear, name patch barely visible above his heart. The knees were worn through, his boots scuffed, the soles tired from 1,000 walks across this base. His hands, stained with grease and time, gripped the handle of his mop with familiarity, like a partner. He had been there the whole time, watching, listening. When General Vance delivered the impossible order, when Dawson rallied his techs and chaos unfolded around the ruined Apache, Frank quietly set his mop aside, and with slow, deliberate steps that seemed jarringly calm in the midst of the frenzy, he began walking toward the wreck. No one noticed at first. Too many eyes were locked on the broken machine. Too many minds were lost in frantic planning and problem-solving. But as Frank drew nearer, one young mechanic, Ramirez, finally caught sight of him. He caught sight of Frank and let out a short, dry laugh. "Look at this," he sneered. "Even the janitor wants a crack at it." A few heads turned, chuckles rippled through the group. Nervous energy had a cruel edge, and today it made people mean. The image was almost cartoonish. This man with a mop stepping forward like he could resurrect a broken Apache in the middle of chaos. It was laughable, absurd. "What's next, Frank?" another tech called out with a smirk. "You gonna polish the rotors clean with that mop of yours?" The laughter that followed wasn't intended to be cruel, not really. But it cut deep anyway, sharp like broken glass on bare concrete. Still, Frank didn't flinch. He didn't turn around, didn't scowl, didn't throw back a single word in defense. He simply walked to the edge of the wreckage, hands on his hips, and looked at the downed Apache not like it was ruined, but as if it were something else entirely, something no one else could see. He stepped closer, crouched low, and let his hand trail along the scorched metal of the side panel. His fingers moved with the gentleness of someone reconnecting with an old friend. His eyes followed the damage not with fear or resignation, but with a steady, quiet knowing. The mocking died down. Confusion took its place. Crews who had just been laughing now stood still, watching as the janitor examined the wreck with the focused calm of a seasoned surgeon preparing to cut. Frank rose to his feet. He turned to face the crowd, eyes meeting theirs without a trace of hesitation. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried with a firmness that demanded attention. She's not beyond saving. General Vance, who had been deep in conversation with Dawson just a few yards away, turned sharply at the sound. His face betrayed little, maybe disbelief, maybe intrigue. "Say again?" he asked, stepping forward. Frank stood his ground, soot-stained hands hanging at his sides. "I said, this bird isn't beyond saving, sir." "Not yet." Vance narrowed his eyes, taking in the man before him. He saw a janitor, worn-out coveralls, work boots streaked with oil, gray stubble shadowing his jaw. But there was something else in Frank's stance, in the way he held himself, in the quiet certainty of his tone, that gave the general pause. "And you are?" Vance asked, cautious. "Frank Sawyer," the man replied without a beat of hesitation. "I've flown her, fixed her under fire, brought her home with failing rotors and no hydraulics, rebuilt her with half a toolbox and a roll of duct tape in the middle of a sandstorm." There was no bravado in his words, no drama, just simple, unshakable truth, the kind that didn't need embellishment or theatrics. A heavy silence followed. Those who had laughed just moments ago stood frozen, the humor dead in their throats. Because now they saw it, really saw it, the depth in Frank's eyes, the way he wore experience like armor. He wasn't a man chasing a moment of glory. He was a man who had lived in the shadows of it longer than most of them had drawn breath. And in that crumpled helicopter, in the middle of that hopeless mess, Frank didn't see a pile of parts waiting for the scrap heap. He saw a mission. Tools clattered onto the concrete. The jokes were gone. The air in Camp Sable's hangar thickened, heavy with expectation, as Frank Sawyer calmly rolled up his sleeves and stepped into the wreck's looming shadow. He wasn't rushing, not because he didn't grasp the urgency, but because he knew every single movement counted. He began at the Apache's nose, his hands gliding gently over the battered metal skin. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his fingers. His eyes scanned every fracture, every gouge, absorbing the story written in damage and fatigue. He ducked beneath the fuselage, tapped along the frame with a slender tool. Each sound, a hollow ring, a flat thud, a sharp tone, spoke volumes. To others, it was meaningless. To Frank, it was the helicopter speaking to him in a language only he understood. "Primary couplings are stressed, but they're holding," he said, pointing to a spot barely visible beneath the frame. "We brace here, she'll hold." Dawson blinked, stunned. "We thought that whole section needed replacing." Frank shook his head. "No time, no parts. We reinforce. She flies." The noise around them shifted again, murmurs fading into focused silence. People began moving to support him, bringing tools, materials. Frank didn't bark commands. He didn't falter. He spoke plainly, directly, with the assuredness of a man who already knew the outcome. He followed a hydraulic line with practiced ease, fingertips feeling the texture, eyes narrowing at a hairline seam no scanner had caught. "There, bypass that manifold. It's leaking slow now, but when pressure builds, it'll dump all your fluid mid-flight. Secondary will handle the load." Ramirez, who had doubted Frank just minutes earlier, found himself rushing to implement the fix without a second thought. Heart-hammering, not from disbelief, but respect. But what truly struck those watching wasn't just Frank's knowledge. It was the way he moved, the way he carried himself. As the world swirled with panic, sirens wailing, the clock ticking, the weight of expectations crushing down, Frank moved with the quiet stillness of someone in the eye of the storm. His confidence wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It radiated from him in every measured step, every calm assessment. It was the kind of confidence that couldn't be taught. It had to be lived. "Feel that vibration," Frank said. Frank stood at the edge of the aircraft as the Apache's rotors began their slow test rotations. "It's not the mount, it's the bracket under it. Swap it." His voice was calm but resolute. Before he finished, Dawson had already placed the replacement part in his hand. The young technician's uncertainty had vanished, replaced by a flicker of respect, maybe even pride, for being part of something bigger than himself. Frank's hands moved quickly, but there was no rush in his motions. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, grounded not only in training, but in intimate familiarity. He didn't need to guess, he remembered. He knew this machine, knew every bolt and seam, every potential failure hidden beneath the surface. The energy around him shifted. What had begun in disorder was settling in a rhythm. The crew, initially skeptical, now mirrored his movements, reacting without being told, absorbing his every instruction. They watched as he worked, not as a man reading from a manual, but as someone who lived and breathed the language of machines. This wasn't academic knowledge. This was experience forged through years and sweat. Frank didn't just repair, he taught. He pointed to a spot on the airframe, explaining how fatigue would show itself there before a fracture ever formed. He explained how a faint whistle meant a seal had loosened, how a tap in just the right place could tell you more than any screen could. Machines talk, he said without looking up. You listen, they'll tell you how to fix them. And they listened, not out of duty, but because it was clear. No one else out there on that flight line could have done what Frank was doing. As the final tweaks came together, Frank climbed into the cockpit. Sweat ran down his brow, streaking through soot and grime. He didn't care. His fingers swept across the controls with a familiarity that time had not dulled. It had been years, but it felt like yesterday. The rotors groaned, then began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, building rhythm. Under his touch, the Apache woke. It wasn't just a machine now, it was alive. Once a crumpled wreck, it now sat proud and humming, a warrior resurrected. On the ground, every head turned. They weren't just watching a helicopter. They were watching him, the man who had brought it back from the dead. The deep, rhythmic whump, whump, whump of the blades beat through the desert night, echoing off the hangars of Camp Sable. The helicopter trembled with power, no longer a memory of failure, but a declaration of capability. Every soul on that tarmac held still, breathless, locked on that cockpit. Even the oppressive desert heat seemed to pause, as though time itself waited. Inside, Frank Sawyer's hands moved with quiet precision. Each dial and switch answered to his touch, as if the machine recognized him, trusted him. The instrument readings weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. They were good enough. Good enough to fly, good enough to prove that this bird wasn't grounded. Not tonight. Frank drew a steady breath. Outside, he could see the faces. Rookie techs, hardened crew, officers, even General Vance. All watching, all waiting. He keyed the radio, voice low but unwavering. Clear the line. Vance didn't hesitate. He raised his hand, signaling the crew to pull back. No one questioned it. Any doubt about Frank, the janitor, the man with a mop, had burned away in the fire of that hangar tonight. The rotors howled, stirring the air into a vortex of grit and dust. The skids trembled, then rose. Just an inch, then more. The Apache hovered 10 feet off the ground, holding steady like it had never fallen. The spotlight swept over its fuselage, catching fresh welds, reinforcing brackets, evidence of the chaos just hours ago. It wasn't pretty, but it held. It flew. Nobody spoke. The laughter that had once followed Frank now hung dead in the air. Even the usual sounds of base life, radio chatter, distant engines were absent. All that remained was the rhythmic pulse of the rotors and the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed the impossible. Frank's face stayed calm. His eyes moved across gauges, over the horizon to the ground below. His hands made subtle corrections, slight adjustments, keeping the helicopter poised like it belonged in the sky. He could have taken it higher, circled the camp, put on a show, but that wasn't who Frank was. This wasn't about applause. It was about proving a point. The bird lived. The mission was alive. The impossible had just been made possible. After a long minute, a minute that seemed to stretch into eternity, Frank guided the Apache gently downward. The skids kissed the ground with the care of a father placing his sleeping child into bed. The rotors slowed, the thundering roar dwindling to a hum, then silence. And no one moved. No one breathed. They just stood there, stunned. Frank opened the hatch and stepped down. His boots hit the tarmac, raising a puff of dust. His hands were blackened with grease and oil. His face, streaked with grime and sweat. He didn't wipe it clean. He didn't need to. He had already spoken, through action. He absently wiped the grease from his hands onto his jumpsuit, turning slowly to face the gathered crowd. The air hung heavy, crackling with silence. General Vance was the first to move. He stepped forward, his eyes no longer squinting with skepticism, but now sharpened with a new and weighty respect. His voice came low, almost reverent, as though louder words might shatter the moment. "Who the hell are you, really?" Frank met his gaze with calm steadiness, every bit as composed as the machine he had just coaxed back to life. "Just a man doing the job in front of him, sir," he replied. "Same as any of us." But that wasn't the truth, not entirely. The stunned, wide-eyed faces around him gave it away. They had seen it now with their own eyes. This wasn't some faceless janitor pushing a mop down quiet hangars. He was something else entirely. A craftsman, a pilot, a miracle worker. He was the kind of man who, once unseen, was now unforgettable. In the hush that followed, the maintenance crew slowly began to stir, their awe settling into admiration. Voices rose, low at first, then louder, as people began to speak of what they'd just witnessed. But Frank didn't linger. He stepped back, letting the Apache's frame cool beneath the sharp white wash of floodlights. His task was complete. The impossible had been done. As General Vance clasped his hand, a firm, deliberate grip full of silent acknowledgement, Frank merely gave a small nod. "Get some rest, boys," he said to the younger techs who had stood beside him in the fire that night. "She'll fly again at dawn." Then without ceremony, he turned and walked away, heading back toward the shadowed hangar. The man they hadn't noticed when the night began had become the one none of them would ever forget. Camp Sable was not the same after that night. The Apache, which hours before had seemed ready for the scrapyard, now stood quietly whole again, its rotor blades still whispering the last echoes of their miraculous return to flight. But the change wasn't only in the machine. Something deeper had shifted. Something within every soul who had watched Frank Sawyer work. Something that could not be measured or unlearned. Word spread like wildfire. First, it was the tech crew, whispering with disbelief and pride about the old janitor who had pulled off the impossible. Then came the medics, the fire team, the tower operators, each adding their part to the growing legend of the quiet man who resurrected an Apache in the dead of night when no one else could. By sunrise, the story had touched every corner of the base, and like all stories worth telling, it began to evolve. The young mechanics, curious and hungry for truth, started asking questions. They combed through personnel files and whispered to anyone who might know more. What they uncovered left them speechless. Frank Sawyer wasn't just some aging janitor or a lucky mechanic with a feel for helicopters. He had once borne a different name, Master Sergeant Frank Spectre Sawyer, a name that lived in murmurs among pilots and old-timers, spoken with awe in late-night mess hall stories and flight school legends. He had flown into places others feared to enter, facing firestorms and mechanical failure, always returning with his crew intact against odds that defied reason. In one classified operation, he'd executed 7 emergency extractions in a single night under relentless enemy fire. In another, he kept an Apache airborne with one hand gripping the throttle and the other physically sealing a ruptured hydraulic line, bringing it down safely even as fuel poured out and systems failed. The call sign Spectre wasn't bestowed lightly. It was earned, through smoke and blood, by a man who seemed to materialize in the darkest hours and always got his people home. But after the wars, after the covert missions and unspoken honors, Frank chose another life. He stepped out of the spotlight and into the shadows. No ceremony, no medals pinned in front of cameras, just quiet work, sweeping hangars, tending machines, living among those who had no idea what kind of man walked beside them. Until that night at Camp Sable, when everything changed. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight gilded the Apache's restored frame, General Vance stood nearby in silence. He looked at the aircraft, then at the men around him, Dawson, Ramirez, and the others. Tired, yes, but lit up with something more than exhaustion. They had seen what few ever do. They had seen greatness hidden in plain sight. There are heroes, Vance said quietly, and then there are men who never ask for the title. Men like Sawyer. Frank, true to form, tried to disappear again. He picked up his mop, wiped his hands, and went back to the kind of work no one ever applauds. But something had changed forever. The base wouldn't let him vanish back into anonymity. Wherever he went, heads turned, not in disbelief, but in respect. Salutes from the same young soldiers who used to overlook him. Nods from officers who had once passed by without a glance. And firm handshakes from men who now understood what real leadership, real courage, and real humility looked like. Maybe that was the legacy Frank Sawyer left behind. Not just that he had restored a downed helicopter. Not just that he had accomplished the unthinkable under pressure, but that he had forced everyone around him to pause and look closer. At the janitor, at the mechanic, at the ones who move silently, who never ask for praise, but when called upon, give everything they have. Because sometimes the truest heroes aren't the ones with medals or fanfare. They're the ones walking beside us unnoticed. Until one night the mission finds them, and they rise. The story of Frank Sawyer, or Master Sergeant Spectre Sawyer, as many now call him with reverent pride, is more than a tale of one man and one machine. It's a reminder that you never truly know who stands beside you until it matters. They aren't always the ones standing tall at the front, basking in praise or applause. Often they're the ones we overlook entirely, the quiet presence in the background, the older man pushing a mop down the hallway, the woman who ensures everything keeps moving smoothly behind the curtain. People like Frank challenge us to pause, to truly see what's right in front of us, and ask ourselves, how many times have we walked past someone without recognizing their quiet excellence? How often have we let surface-level appearances, a name tag, worn boots, a humble uniform, blind us to the deep well of experience standing right there? In a world that constantly teaches us to value noise, spotlight, titles, and appearances, Frank Sawyer stands as a sharp, humbling contrast. His story is a clear reminder that real value doesn't lie in medals, promotions, or applause. It's found in integrity, in consistency, in doing the hard thing when it counts, especially when no one's watching. It's about character, not decoration, presence, not position. So take a moment to think. Think of your own life. Have you ever looked past someone because they didn't seem important? Maybe it was someone at your job who never spoke up, or a neighbor who quietly lent a hand when no one else noticed. Maybe even someone in your family who always showed up, never asked for thanks, and simply got things done. Quiet strength is easy to miss, but once you've seen it, you realize how powerful it truly is. We'd love to hear your reflections. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about the unsung heroes in your life, the Frank Sawyers you now recognize with new eyes. And if this story stirred something in you, made you reconsider what heroism really looks like, consider subscribing to our channel. Give this video a like, pass it along to someone who might need the reminder, and join us in celebrating the strength that doesn't need to shout. Because sometimes the greatest heroes don't stand in the spotlight. They simply show up quietly and steadily, and through their presence alone, they change everything. Thank you for being here. Let's not just admire these quiet heroes and stories. Let's learn to truly see them in our everyday lives and treat them with the honor and respect they've long deserved.